When having conversations with people regarding truth, I think it's important to have a good understanding of a couple characteristics of truth. The first characteristic of truth that I want to talk about is what I'm going to call the multidimensionality of truth. And this is the idea that truth has many layers to it. For instance, when you're asked a question, there are multiple levels of analysis that you could use to answer this question. There's multiple levels of true answers that you could give to a question. Now, I want to make clear that this characteristic of truth is not nearly the same as truth being relative. This is not saying that truth is relative. This is simply saying that there are truths and there are falsehoods, but in the category of truth, there are multiple layers to that truth, and there are multiple potential true answers to a question, so to speak. I've heard a good analogy to explain this idea of truth's multidimensionality, and I'm not sure where this analogy first originated. I've heard it a couple times in the context of Oxford University. There's a couple Oxford professors who have used this analogy, namely Dr. Ard Louis and Dr. John Lennox. But the analogy goes something like this. There's two men who are boiling water in a kettle. We as the observers go up to the first man and ask, "Sir, why is the water in your kettle boiling?" The first man, being a bit of a scientific thinker, says, well, the water in my kettle is boiling because either the heat element or the fire that's under my kettle is transferring heat energy into the kettle, which then transfers heat energy into the water, and it excites the water molecules up to the boiling point of water, and that is why the water in my kettle is boiling. And being satisfied with the first man's answer, we say, "That's a fine answer, thank you, sir." And we ask the second man, "Sir, why is the water in your kettle boiling?" And him, being a more practical and pragmatic thinker, says, "Well, it's boiling because I want a cup of tea." Now, though that analogy is meant to be slightly humorous, I think it demonstrates very well this idea of truth's multidimensionality. You have two people who answer the same question, but they both answer it in very different ways. One person answers it with a more scientific mind, and the other person answers it with a more practical or just ordinary, down-to-earth sort of mindset. We'll notice that though these are both very different answers to the same question, they are both true. And this really is the idea of truth's multidimensionality. They were both answering the same question, and they both answered it 100% truthfully, but these answers were very different. And again, I want to remind you that this is not the idea that truth is relative. This is not the idea that what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me. This is not that idea. This is the idea that there are concrete truths and there are concrete falsehoods. But in the category of concrete truth, we have multiple layers to this truth that could be dealt with or looked at in several different ways. Now, from a Christian perspective, and especially in the realm of possibly Christian apologetics, this characteristic of truth becomes very handy to be aware of, especially in discussions of scientific truth versus religious truth or versus spiritual truth, right? A lot of times those two things are pitted against each other, scientific truth and spiritual truth, or scientific truth and religious truth. And so this idea of truth's multidimensionality can help us out when we're discussing these two layers of truth, we could say. Psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson has a very interesting lecture where he took a few minutes to describe what he thought the problem was between the two seemingly opposing viewpoints of Christian fundamentalism and scientific atheism. And I'll link that lecture below with the specific time codes of the portion that I'm referencing. But essentially what Dr. Peterson says is that Christian fundamentalists and scientific atheists have essentially the same problem. He says that it seems to him that both Christian fundamentalists and scientific atheists look at the Bible through the lens of scientific assertions. And so the Christian fundamentalists seem to look at, say, the narrative of Genesis, and they say the assertion that the earth was created in 7 literal days 5 or 10,000 years ago is a scientific assertion, and it happens to be correct. Whereas the scientific atheist would look at that and say that is a scientific assertion, that the earth was created in that way, but it happens to be wrong. That is a wrong scientific assertion. What Peterson asserts essentially is that the problem arises because both of these groups are looking at the biblical narrative as scientific truth. They're both analyzing it on the same level. They're taking the biblical narrative and putting it on the same level of truth as scientific assertions, basically. And Peterson says the problem with that, firstly, is that the Bible was written, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And if you know anything about the history of ideas, he said modern science, the way it functions today, was not a thing until 1,000, maybe even as early as 500 years ago. And he says, so to assume that the Bible was written with science in mind is to misunderstand the biblical authors and to misunderstand the cultural climate of the day. And then secondly, he says the big problem is that we shouldn't assume that the only level of truth is scientific assertion. He says there are limits to how far scientific assertion can take us. For instance, scientific assertions cannot answer questions of meaning or value or purpose for humans. And so Peterson asserts that when we look at something like the biblical narrative, we should maybe keep in mind that maybe we don't need just one view of the world, a scientific view. Maybe we need two views of the world. Maybe we need multiple layers of truth from which to analyze the world in which we live. We need to understand the multidimensional aspect of truth so that we can look at issues that are accessible by science and understand those. And then we can also look at issues that are only accessible through metaphysical lines of thought or religious lines of thought and analyze those in those ways. So that's an example of where truth's multidimensionality can be useful when we are analyzing the world, when we're analyzing ideas, when we're analyzing the world around us. We have to realize that possibly one dimension of truth is not enough to analyze the world in which we live. The next characteristic of truth that I want to deal with is the exclusivity of truth. Now, it might seem odd to deal with this idea of truth's exclusivity after we have just said that truth is multidimensional. But I hope as we go forward here, you'll be able to see what I'm saying. Essentially, the idea of truth exclusivity is this idea that I was trying to distinguish from the beginning, saying that truth's multidimensionality is not the same as truth being relative to a person. You know, it's not that what's true for you is true for you and what's true for me is true for me. Truth's exclusivity is essentially to say that there are truths and there are falsehoods, and those are relatively concrete, so to speak. So one very simple way of illustrating this is to say, there is a camera in front of me right now. That's either true or it's not. Now, the fact that you're watching me on a screen indicates to you that there was probably a camera, or actually it indicates to you that there was certainly a camera in front of me filming what I'm saying, what I'm doing. And so that is a verifiable truth. To assert that that is false, that there is a camera in front of me, would not be logical. It would be logically incoherent. Another way to illustrate this would be to take it into the realm of religion. We could say either there is a God or there is not. Now, I know that's a very simplistic way of stating that claim, because we could get into questions of, well, how are we defining God? Are we open to the possibility of there being multiple gods? But don't let those things muddy this idea that we're trying to get at here. Either there is a God or there isn't. Let's make it a little more specific to make it a little bit more concrete, possibly. Let's say the God of Christianity is real or he is not. There's not really much room for an intermediary phase there. There's not really much room for anything else in the middle. Either he is real or he is not. This has interesting implications, again, in the realm of Christian apologetics, because if you can make good arguments for why God might exist, you can continue to make a more and more concrete case for God because of truth's exclusivity. Another realm where truth's exclusivity might come in handy from a Christian perspective is in answering the question, is Jesus really the only way to God? And again, we can say that either Jesus is the only way to God or he is not. And you might say, well, that's not really helpful because, yes, it's true that either he is or he isn't, but how do we know that his claim to be the only way to God is true? And I would say, well, you keep narrowing it down from there. So either it's true that he's the only way to God or it's not. The way we would verify that is he said he was the only way to God. And one way we could go about proving that assertion is to ask questions about his credibility and to see if he truly was who he said he was, or if he was a poser or a lunatic, for instance. And you can make arguments using truth's exclusivity and using more probable arguments than not, and you can slowly factor those things down to where you can come to arguments of Jesus' reliability and his resurrection and whether those are true or not. And you can make a good case for whether Jesus is truly the only way to God or not. Now, obviously, there's many detailed steps that would need to work into some of these arguments, but I've just laid out the basic idea for you, and I'm trying to show you how truth's exclusivity can be used in some of these frames of discussion and thought. So to recap, in this video we've seen two characteristics of truth. First, we looked at the multidimensionality of truth, and we showed that though truth is not relative, truth does have multiple layers to it. And so when asking a question, there could be multiple true answers to that, depending on which level of analysis we're working with. And then the second thing we looked at is truth's exclusivity, that is to say that there are concrete truths and concrete falsehoods. And we very briefly looked at a couple ways that truth's multidimensionality and truth's exclusivity could be used in Christian scenarios of discussion, Christian scenarios of apologetics. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it interesting or helpful, I hope you'll give it a like and that you'll share it, and that you'll consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for listening and have a good one.